Hello, we are going through Chapter 7 today of Greek for the Rest of Us. These are overview videos summarizing Bill Mounce's third edition of Greek for the Rest of Us, and today we're going to be looking at English verbs. So a verb is a word that describes an action or a state of being. Those state of being verbs would be stative. And verbs have person, number, and tense. An example here of person, there's three persons in English. Those are first, second, and third persons. The first person is the I category, or if it's plural, we. We also would have in the second person you, or if you're down south and you want to pluralize the second person, it's y'all. And then we have third person, which would be he or she or it. And an example of kind of the way that these words inflect, a verb specifically inflects. If you take the word for being, you would say, I am. But that same word, if you try to say it in the second person, you would not say you am. You would say you are. But then also, if you get to the third person, you wouldn't say he am or he are. You would say he is. But if you make it plural, so the plural of he, more than one he, would be they. And now it would no longer be they is, it would be they are. So we get and we understand that verbs inflect, and then they must agree with their subject. So there has to be an agreement between the subject, in this case, for example, they, with the verb are. They have to agree in person and in number. So what about tense? Section 7.5 talks about English tense. And in English, tense refers to the time when the action of the verb takes place. So we have three main tenses that we're pretty familiar with. We have the present tense. We have the future tense. And we have the past tense. So you'd see things like in the present tense, I study. In the future, I will study, or in the past, I studied. So these verbs, again, inflect. They change their form based on their function and what they're doing and how they're being used in a sentence. So there's principal parts in English. So English verbs divide into three forms, and these are the past, and the past participle. So we see this exemplified here in this little paradigm where we have to swim based on whether it's in the present tense or present principal part, swim, or in the past principal part, I swam, or the past participle, we had swum. Again, that usually requires the helping verb of had. This is also seen in to walk. I walk presently. In the past, I walked. Or we would say, I had walked the mall, or whatever it was that I had walked. So these are the principal parts in English: present, past, and past participles. Now what about voice? Voice is the relationship between the verb and its subject. So it's either going to be in the active or it's going to be in the passive. When a verb is active, the subject is doing the action of the verb. When a verb is passive, the subject is receiving the action of the verb. So an example of this is I hit the ball. That would be an active hit. But I could communicate the same thing in a passive way. So I could say, I, still the subject, same subject, was hit by the ball. So here we have a passive sense where I was hit by the ball. Something happened to me. And this happens in ways in which we want to communicate the same thing that we don't actually want to incriminate ourselves. Like we could say, I left the door open, when maybe the door wasn't supposed to be left open. But I could also say, if I wanted to not mention me, I could say the door was left open. Or perhaps rather than I ate the cake, I could just say the cake was eaten. Or in the case, again, we're looking at these participles, principal parts here, and specifically the past participle is that something just happened. So rather than I broke the clock, or I broke the very valuable vase, I would say the valuable vase was broken. So that's voice. That's going to be important when we start to look at the Greek verbs. Let's talk a little bit about mood. Mood refers to the relationship between the verb and reality. So voice is looking at the verb and its subject in that relationship. Mood is looking at the verb and reality. So the three moods in English. There's the indicative mood. It just describes that something is, as opposed to something that may be or might be. The subjunctive mood describes what may or might be. It is not the mood of reality, but of possibility or probability. An example of this is, I might learn Hebrew, or if I were a rich man, I would hire a Greek tutor. That idea of uncertainty is present, or possibility, probability, I might go to the mall. If I were to do that, blank. There's that uncertainty element that's a part of English verbs when they're in the subjunctive. And then lastly, there is the imperative. The imperative mood is used to state a command. So it's not just indicating something. It's not just saying it might happen. It's saying there's an oughtness to it. You must do this thing. Go to the mall. So just a note, in this next section we're going to be touching on infinitives and participles. And they're technically not moods. I'm going to just circle that in red. Participles, infinitives, these are not moods. But, that said, they usually get discussed in the same place. So it makes sense to talk through them in this place because that's typically where grammars are going to talk about infinitives and participles. It's just important to realize that really these are the three English moods. There are only three. So when we're talking about infinitives and participles, we're not talking about moods. That said, let's talk about the infinitive. So an infinitive, briefly, it is a verbal noun. So fundamentally it is a noun, but it's related to verbs. So in English, the way we have infinitives is we use the word to help. So to read is the infinitive form of the verb read. Next we have participles. And here participles are verbal adjectives. So rather than being verbal nouns, they're verbal adjectives. And these are formed by adding on ing to the end of words. So again, it's an adjective, so it becomes something that modifies a noun. So you could say the student. What kind of student? How are you going to clarify what he's doing? The student reading the book. ... Obviously, there has to be more to that sentence. But the emphasis is here's the noun, and then reading here is functioning as an adjective because it's describing a student. So it's functioning adjectively. And that's why it's a verbal adjective, because at root, this is a verb, but it's functioning as an adjective. So it's a verbal adjective. All right, so next we have the participial phrases. A participle and its accompanying element form a participial phrase. So just to clarify that, in the case of our example up here, reading the book would be the participial phrase. All right, let's take a moment to talk about word order. So Greek uses inflection to link the participle to the word it modifies, whereas English relies on word order. So in English, we wouldn't say the reading book student the, or the reading student the book. In English, we couldn't scramble the word order, but in Greek, because it relies on the inflection, the word order can be rearranged, whereas in English, we need to have it in direct progression. There are two types of participles. Those are going to be adverbial and adjectival participles. So in the case of an adverbial participle, you could have a participle that's giving information about when something took place, for example. So an example given is after praying, he taught us. So the after praying is not describing he, it's actually describing taught. So this participle, praying, is being functioning adverbially because it's modifying the verb. And then we already saw an example of an adjectival participle when we looked at this example up here. Next, we'll touch on gerunds. So in English, we also have what are called gerunds. These are identical in form to participles, so they're going to have that ing ending on the end there. But instead of functioning as an adjective, which again, by definition, participles are verbal adjectives. So instead of functioning as an adjective, they actually function as a noun. So this is when one of those ing verbs actually becomes a noun in the sentence. So in the case here is living well is a goal of our culture. Or you could say running is my passion. In the case of running here, you have normally a verb, but because this is a verb that's functioning as the subject, this would be a gerund. Now, Greek does not have gerunds because the Greek participle can function as a noun as well as an adjective. So the participle in Greek functions as a noun and an adjective. So unlike in English where we have technically a different definition between a participle and a gerund, in Greek all of that is going to be under the category of participle, which means participles in Greek are going to be very important. We'll end up spending a whole chapter just looking at participles later on because these are a very important concept to grasp in Greek. So Mounce introduces what he refers to as phrasing. I'll be using that interchangeably with the term block diagramming. But when you're phrasing or block diagramming, you have to be able to identify the beginning and the end of a participial phrase. The participial phrase is always dependent, so it's going to be modifying something. It's going to be dependent on something. So it's going to be connected to something that you're going to need to be able to find in that sentence. All right, let's talk about aspect for a moment. English aspect. Aspect is perhaps the most difficult concept to grasp in Greek verbs, while it's still one of the most important. So it's a hard concept, and it's critical to grasp. The basic genius of, again, we're talking about the Greek for a moment. The basic genius of the Greek verb is not its ability to indicate when the action of the verb occurs, which is referred to as time, but actually the type of action it describes, and that's what we call aspect. So the type of action is the aspect. In English, there are three aspects. We have the undefined, the continuous, and the perfective aspect. The undefined aspect means that the action of the verb is thought of as a simple event without commenting on whether or not it's a process, whether or not it's in process, or whether or not it's a completed action. It's just saying this event happened. It's not defined the specifics of how it happened or whether or not it's going to be a completed or in progress thing. That is in contrast to the continuous aspect, where the action of the verb is actually an ongoing process. So within the continuous aspect is the element of an ongoing, continual thing. And then we have the perfective aspect, which describes something that is brought to completion. It's finished, it's final, and its results are felt in the present. So an example of an undefined event or an undefined aspect would be simply God loved the world, or he gave his son. But then a continuous would be something like we were praying continually. So the were here tells us this is past time, so that the time is something that happened in the past, but the aspect is continual. It's constantly happening. And in the case of perfective, we could say something like, we ate dinner. And that's perhaps a little bit ambiguous whether or not it's undefined or perfective, but another example would be, we have eaten dinner. Or again, it's communicating something that happened, it's brought to completion, we already have done it, but there's results that are continuing into the present. In the case of eating dinner, a lack of hunger. All right, that's a lot to take in. Let's briefly go through the vocabulary for this section. A couple more prepositions, which relates to our last section. We have epi, might also show up as ep or f, depending on how that elision interacts with other words nearby it. In the genitive, it means on or when. In the dative, it means on the basis of or at. And in the accusative, it means on, to, or against. Kata or kat or kath is going to, in the genitive, mean against. In the accusative, according to or throughout. Meta, met or meth, is going to mean in the genitive with and in the accusative after. And then a few words here that are easier to combine, but it's important to keep them separate. You have oo or ook or ooks. That all means not. And then may is going to mean not or lest. Hinna, very theologically significant word, shows up in a lot of places, means in order that, so that, or that. Notice the colon here, semicolon. These are technically different semantic categories within this word, so it's important to memorize those distinctly. In order that, so that, or that. Then we have hati, which means that or because. Gar means for, and un means therefore or so that is another way it's seen. So therefore or so for un. And that is your vocabulary for Chapter 7.